The house was quiet when my phone made a notification sound. I put the unread newspaper aside and reached for the bedside table. I've never been a fan of modern technology, but at my age 74, you have to put up with these devices. If only so, the kids think you're a helpless old man who can be manipulated. I glanced at the screen and frowned. The banking app Helen had installed on my phone a week ago was reporting a large debit. Transaction notification. Deposit of £2,000 recipient. Royal Cruise Line. My hand froze on the phone. My heart clenched painfully, but not from shock, but from the bitter confirmation of what I'd suspected long ago. My own daughter, Helen, had stolen my credit card information. I sank slowly into the chair by the window, looking out over the neat garden I'd always kept in order despite my age. Helen's recent visit popped into my mind. She had come ostensibly to check on me and help me set up my new smartphone. "Dad, you need to learn how to use the banking app," she said with that condescending smile I hated so much. "It's so much more convenient than going to a branch." I agreed, playing the helpless old man who has trouble understanding modern technology. But I could see perfectly well how she insisted I write down all the passwords and access codes in a notepad. "In case you forget, Dad." And I dutifully wrote it down, of course, even though I had a better memory than many 40-year-olds. I remembered her leaning over my shoulder as I entered the card details to activate the app. I intentionally did it slowly, giving her plenty of time to memorize or take a picture of the information. Back then, I was just testing my theory. Now I had proof. Since the death of my wife, Elizabeth, 5 years ago, my relationship with my children had grown even colder. Helen and her brother Percy had always been closer to their mother. She spoiled them, protected them from my strictness. When she was gone, they stopped even pretending that my opinion meant anything. Visits became infrequent and always accompanied by requests for money or favors. Helen is 48 years old and works as a logistics coordinator for a shipping company. Her husband Ezra, a boring and cowardly man, is an inspector for the IRS. They have good salaries, their own house in the suburbs of Buckingham, but they've always been short. Every time I saw them, they complained about the mortgage, about their children's expensive education, about how hard life is for the middle class. I got up from my chair and went to the window. My garden was blooming, even though it was early fall. I've always found comfort in working with plants. They don't betray, they don't lie, they don't pretend. Unlike people, unlike my children. I could call the bank right now and block the card. I could have called Helen and made a scene. But something inside me resisted that simple decision. For years I had silently tolerated their neglect, their subtle hints of my senility, their condescending smiles. Perhaps it was time to show that old Norton Butterfield was not yet out of his mind. Rather than act rashly, I decided to gather more information. I sat down at my desk, took out an old leather-bound notebook, a gift from Elizabeth for our 40th anniversary, and wrote down the facts, the date of the transaction, the amount, the name of the company. Then I dialed the bank's number. "Hello, I'd like to clarify information on one of my card transactions," I said when the operator answered. "Of course, Mr. Butterfield. Please state the last 4 digits of your card and your date of birth for identification purposes." I dictated the necessary information, trying to sound slightly concerned but not panicked. "I received a notice of a fairly large charge to some cruise company, but I don't recall making such a payment. Could you be more specific?" "Just a moment, Mr. Butterfield, I'll check. Yes, I see a transaction for £2,000 to Royal Cruise Line dated yesterday, September 22nd. That's the advance booking deposit. Full payment of £6,000 is scheduled for October 15th. I felt the blood rush to my face. £8,000. Helen and her husband were planning to spend $8,000 of my money on a luxury cruise. I took a deep breath, trying to remain calm. "Tell me, is there any way to find out exactly what booking was made? The name of the cruise or the destination?" Unfortunately, we don't have that information, Mr. Butterfield. We can only see the payee and the amount. You'll have to contact the cruise company directly for details. I see. Can I cancel a future payment? The one scheduled for October 15th. Yes, of course. We can block that particular transaction or place a limit on the amount of charges on your card. Which would you prefer? I wondered. If I just block a future transaction, Helen might try to use the card for other purchases. On the other hand, if I block the card completely, she'll immediately realize that I've discovered her shenanigans. Don't block anything yet, I decided. I want to get to the bottom of this first. But tell me, what's the name of this cruise company? I'd like to contact them directly. Royal Cruise Line, Mr. Butterfield. It's a fairly well-known luxury cruise operator. Thank you for the information. One more question. Was this transaction done online or in person? According to the transaction code, it was an online payment, Mr. Butterfield. I see. Thank you for your help. I hung up the phone and leaned back in my chair. My suspicions were confirmed. Helen had copied my card details and used them to make an online purchase. I imagined her and Ezra planning a luxury vacation at my expense, perhaps even laughing at the silly old man who wouldn't notice. The thought caused me to feel anger, but also a strange, cold calmness. In the years since Elizabeth's death, I'd learned to contain my emotions, to observe and wait. Now, those skills would come in handy. I opened the laptop, another device I supposedly didn't know how to handle according to my children. In fact, I was quite competent with modern technology. I just preferred them to think otherwise. It was more convenient. Upon finding Royal Cruise Line's website, I was impressed with the luxury of the voyages offered. Mediterranean cruises, Caribbean islands, exotic Asian itineraries, all with 5-star service, onboard spas, fine dining. No wonder Helen was tempted. I wrote down the company's phone number. Tomorrow I would call them and try to find out the details of the booking. But first I needed to think things over carefully. I went to the window again and looked out at my garden. Over the years I had grown dozens of different flowers and shrubs here. Each plant required patience, attention to detail, and the right time to intervene. Perhaps the same strategy would work now. I could just block the card and deprive Helen and Ezra of their cruise. But that would be too easy, too merciful. After all the years of neglect, after their constant attempts to control my life under the pretense of caring, they deserved something more. Something to make them realize that they weren't dealing with a helpless old man, but a man who saw everything and understood everything. A plan began to form in my head, not just a plan to prevent the theft, but something deeper, a lesson they would remember for a long time, perhaps forever. I picked up my phone and opened my contacts. I needed to consult with someone I trusted. The only person I could call a true friend was Algernon Holder, simply Algie to those closest to me. We had known each other for almost 60 years, since our university days. He was an ex-lawyer whose sharp mind had not dulled with age. I dialed his number knowing he'd be home at this time, probably doing a complex crossword puzzle or reading another detective story. Algie, it's Norton. We need to talk. What's the matter, old sport? His voice sounded concerned. I rarely call unannounced. It seems my daughter thought I was old and stupid enough not to notice the theft of £8,000 from my credit card. There was a long, low whistle in the receiver. That's a twist. Are you sure? Absolutely. The deposit has already been paid. The full amount will be debited on October 15th. A luxury cruise. What are you going to do? I heard a familiar note in Algie's voice, a mixture of legal interest and friendly involvement. That's what I wanted to talk to you about. I need some advice. Come by tomorrow afternoon. We'll discuss it over a game of chess. I agreed and hung up. It was going to be a sleepless night, but not because of anxiety or anger. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling and methodically working out the details of my plan. After all, Patience was a virtue I had mastered perfectly in my 74 years, and now it was time to reap the benefits of that patience. The morning was overcast, but it didn't rain. I love this kind of weather. It's thought-provoking and makes it seem as if the whole world is slowed down, giving you time to think about your next move. I sat at the kitchen table, sipping strong tea and going over my options. Before calling the cruise company, I needed to think through a cover story. I couldn't just say I was checking the reservation in my daughter's name. That would arouse suspicion. I picked up the phone and dialed the Royal Cruise Line number I found on their website yesterday. After a few beeps, a pleasant female voice answered. "Royal Cruise Line, how can I help you?" I coughed and spoke in the slightly unsure tone of an older person using a cruise company for the first time. "Good afternoon. My name is Archibald Mortimer. I would like to inquire about the cruises you are offering in October. My friends recently booked a trip with you and they were very complimentary about it." "Of course, sir. We have some great itineraries in October. Have you thought about a specific destination? The Mediterranean, the Caribbean, or maybe Scandinavia?" "You see, I'm not quite sure. My friends, the Wordsworth family, haven't specified an itinerary, just dates. They're leaving in mid-October, I think." I held my breath. It was a risky move, but if I understood correctly, operators usually have access to the reservation database. "One moment, sir. Let me check." A short pause followed. "Yes, we have a reservation under the name Wordsworth. It's a Mediterranean elegance cruise, departing October 20th from Southampton. 12 days, visiting Lisbon, Barcelona, Rome, Venice, and the Greek islands. One of our most popular itineraries. I felt my heart start to beat faster. There it was, direct confirmation. Helen and Ezra had indeed used my card to pay for a luxury Mediterranean cruise. "Sounds amazing," I said with feigned enthusiasm. "And your cabins must be very comfortable?" "Oh yes, sir. The Wordsworths have chosen a premium balcony stateroom. It's a very spacious suite with a separate living area, panoramic sea views, and access to an exclusive lounge bar. Would you like to book one of these?" "Maybe," I said. "But is this cruise already fully paid for, or is it just a deposit?" "At the moment we have a deposit of £2,000. Full payment is due by October 15th. "I see. And what is the total cost of this voyage for two people?" "A premium cabin with balcony for two people costs £8,000, including all-inclusive meals, access to the spa, and all on-board entertainment. £8,000. That's how much they plan to steal from my card." I felt anger rise up inside me, but I immediately suppressed it. This was no time for emotion. "Thank you for the information. It sounds wonderful. I'll check with my wife and get back to you." "We'd be happy to help you with your reservation, Mr. Mortimer. Have a good day." I hung up the phone and took a deep breath. I now had all the confirmations. I knew the exact amount, dates, and even the type of cabin they had chosen. £8,000 for a luxury vacation was not a small sum for someone living on a pension. I didn't care about the money, though. It was their disregard, their belief that I was so weak and naive that I would not notice such a large theft. I glanced at my watch, almost 11 o'clock. There were still 3 hours before I could meet Algie. I had plenty of time to prepare and think over the details of the upcoming conversation. I went upstairs and began to dress. Unlike many of my peers, I had always paid attention to my appearance. Even after Elizabeth's death, I hadn't slumped and turned into a slovenly widower. Aero pants, shirt, tie, and tweed jacket are my constant style. Elizabeth always said I looked like an Oxford professor, and I liked the comparison. At exactly 2 o'clock, I drove up to Algie's house in one of Buckingham's quiet neighborhoods. His small cottage was surrounded by greenery. Algie, like me, was a keen gardener. No sooner had I knocked than the door opened. "Norton, old boy, come in quickly." Algie, A tall, thin man with a mop of gray hair smiled welcomingly. In spite of his 78 years, he remained remarkably cheerful and clear-headed. We went into the living room, where the dinner table was already set. Algie lived alone. His wife had died almost 10 years ago, and his children had gone to different countries. He was an excellent cook and often joked that cooking and chess were the two activities that kept his brain from rusting. "I made your favorite kidney pie," he said, pointing to the table. "It looks delicious," I replied sincerely. We sat down at the table and Algie poured red wine into glasses. "To the reunion of old friends," he toasted. "And to the restoration of justice," I added. Algie looked at me carefully over his glasses. "Tell me, what did you find out?" I methodically recounted everything I had learned. The transaction, the conversation with the bank, the call to the cruise company. Algie listened in silence, nodding occasionally and taking small sips of wine. £8,000, he whistled when I finished. Not a small sum for a surprise. "It's not a surprise, Algie, it's theft. They weren't even going to tell me. They just used my card and hoped I wouldn't notice. So, what do you plan to do about it?" Algie put away his fork and knife. "Block the card? Call the police?" I shook my head. "No, that would be too easy. I want to teach them a lesson. Something they'll remember for a long time." Algie leaned back in his chair, his eyes sparkling with interest. In his youth, he had been one of the most inventive lawyers in Buckingham, known for his unconventional approaches to cases. "I have some ideas," I said slowly, "but I need your advice. You've always been the best strategist of the two of us." "Well, let's talk about it." Algie rubbed his chin. "First, we need to figure out what you want to accomplish. Just keep them from getting the cruise? Or something more?" "More," I answered firmly. "For years they've treated me like a helpless old man, manipulated me, lied to me, pretended to care when they needed something. I want them to realize that I saw it all, I understood, and that I'm not a helpless victim." Algie nodded thoughtfully. "Then simply blocking the card won't do. We need something more elegant." We moved on to chess, our traditional pastime during meetings. As we played, we discussed various variations of the plan. Algie suggested legal subtleties. I added psychological details based on my knowledge of Helen and Ezra's characters. "You say Ezra works for the IRS?" Algie asked suddenly, moving his horse. "Yes, for over 15 years now. He's a mid-level inspector." "And you're sure he's not clean?" I grinned. "Absolutely. I overheard them talking to Helen a few years ago. He helped some clients optimize their taxes for a fee. Nothing massive, but enough to lose their jobs and reputations if it came up." Algie smiled. That special smile I remembered from my college days. It meant he had an idea in his head. "I still have connections in the IRS," he said. "Old colleagues I worked with on financial irregularities. Perhaps an anonymous letter with specific facts might interest some of them." I stepped forward. "Go on." "Imagine, your card suddenly refuses to pay for a cruise at a crucial moment. At the same time, an audit based on an anonymous tip begins at Ezra's work. Coincidence? I doubt they'd think so." I nodded slowly, feeling the plan take shape. "What about Helen?" I asked. "She's always been the main manipulator in the family." "For her, we have direct evidence of credit card fraud," Algie replied. "You may not have to file a formal police report, but the very threat of doing so could be a powerful leverage." We continued to discuss the details of the plan, and gradually it became clearer and clearer. By the end of our meeting, we had a strategy ready, not just to prevent the theft, but to let Helen and Ezra know that they were not facing a helpless old man, but a man who could stand up for himself. I was about to leave when my phone rang. Helen's name popped up on the screen. I showed the phone to Algie and raised an eyebrow. He nodded, and I answered the call, putting it on speaker. "Dad?" Helen's voice sounded unusually animated. "How are you doing?" "Not bad, dear. Just visiting Algie. Oh, tell him I said hello. Listen, Ezra and I wanted to invite you to dinner Friday night. Nothing fancy, just family night. I looked over at Algie. That was unexpected. Helen usually only called when she needed something. Friday? I pretended to check my calendar. Yeah, I guess I'm free. What time? 7 o'clock? We could pick you up. No, that's okay. I'll drive myself. I'm still quite capable of driving, I said with a touch of irony. Of course, Daddy, I was just suggesting it. She sounded annoyed, but she hid it quickly. Then we'll see you at 7. We have some news. I'll look forward to it, I replied as sincerely as I could. After I hung up, Algie and I exchanged understanding glances. Some news, Algie repeated with a chuckle. I wonder if it's the cruise they're going to tell you about. I bet they are, I nodded. Probably some story about a windfall or a bonus at work. Well, that gives us an added advantage, Algie said as he walked me to the door. They'll give you information that you can use against them later. Right. I'll play the part of the gullible father, happy to see their good fortune. And don't forget to notice every detail of their lies, Algie added. Every little detail can be useful. We said goodbye, agreeing to call Helen and Ezra after my dinner. When I got home, I found an email from Percy, my son. This was a rarity. He usually preferred not to keep in touch except on holidays or when he needed money. In the email, he inquired about my health and mentioned that he was going to be coming to Buckingham in a couple weeks for work. I grinned grimly. It looked like Helen had already contacted her brother about the family dinner. They were clearly up to something, and I was more than sure it had to do with my credit card and their luxury cruise. Friday came faster than I expected. I carefully prepared for dinner, thinking through every detail of my behavior. I had to appear slightly distracted but interested in their news, naive enough to believe any made-up story. Helen and Ezra's home was in the upscale Buckingham neighborhood, a large pseudo-Tudor-style mansion with a manicured lawn and a 3-car garage. Normally, this ostentatious luxury would irritate me, especially since every few months they asked me for money for unexpected expenses. But today, I was looking at their house with a new feeling, a mixture of irony and anticipation. Helen met me at the door with an unusually wide smile. "Papa, I'm so glad to see you." She hugged me with exaggerated enthusiasm. I smiled back, trying to look touched by her attention. "It's good to see you too, dear. How are my grandchildren doing?" "Oh, they're fine. They're spending the night at a friend's house tonight." She waved her hand, clearly not wanting to discuss the subject. Her children, my grandchildren, 16-year-old Tabitha and 14-year-old Jeremiah, were typical spoiled teenagers who treated me with the same mixture of disdain and self-interest as their parents. Ezra came out of the living room holding out his hand. "Norton, it's good to see you in good health." I shook his hand, noting to myself the fake cordiality in his voice. Ezra was always a bad actor. "Thank you, Ezra. You look great, too." We walked to the dining room where a table was set with obviously restaurant-bought food. Helen never liked to cook. "Can I pour you some wine, Dad?" Helen asked, pointing to an open bottle of red. "Just a little," I answered. "I still have to drive." "You could stay the night," she suggested with ostentatious concern. "The guest room is always ready." "Thank you, but I prefer to sleep in my own bed," I said softly. At my age, habits meant a lot. We sat down at the table and Helen began setting out plates of food. Ezra filled the glasses with wine and proposed a toast. "To family and to good news." I took a small sip and looked at them questioningly. "So, what was the news you wanted to tell me?" Helen and Ezra exchanged glances of ill-concealed excitement. "Well," Ezra began, coughing, "we've had a good month. There was an employee raffle at work, and guess what? I won the grand prize." "You did?" I acted surprised. "And what was the prize?" "A Mediterranean cruise," Helen exclaimed, not letting her husband finish. 12 days on a luxury liner. Can you imagine, Dad? I smiled broadly, hoping my face was expressing genuine joy and not the irony I felt. This is wonderful. What good fortune. And when are you leaving? October 20th, Ezra said, putting on his salad. The itinerary is fantastic. Lisbon, Barcelona, Rome, Venice, the Greek islands. Sounds delightful, I said sincerely, thinking about how carefully they'd planned their lie. And is the cabin nice? Oh, yes. Helen was glowing with enthusiasm. With a balcony, a separate living area, and access to an exclusive lounge bar. Imagine the view of the sea in the morning. I mentally chuckled. She was repeating almost word for word what the cruise operator had told me. Apparently, Helen had already enjoyed the virtual cabin tour on the Royal Cruise Line website. All this as a prize at work? I allowed myself a little surprise. That's a generous IRS. Ezra choked a little on his wine. Well, it's not exactly from the IRS. It's a sponsorship prize from a major accounting firm we work with. I see, I nodded, pretending to be completely satisfied with that explanation. Dinner continued, and Helen and Ezra couldn't stop talking about the upcoming cruise. They discussed the excursions they planned to take, the restaurants on board, the evening entertainment programs. With each passing minute, their story became more and more enthusiastic, and I noticed how they gradually relaxed, seeing my sincere interest and lack of suspicion. I played the role of an admiring listener, asking questions and expressing joy at their good fortune. Inwardly, I recorded every detail of their lives, every inconsistency in their story. It would all come in handy later when it was time for my move. Have you paid for the cruise in full? I asked casually when Helen brought the dessert. Not quite, Ezra mumbled. We put down a deposit and we have to pay in full by October 15th. But that's not a problem, Helen added quickly. It's already scheduled. I nodded understandingly, hiding a smile. Of course it's scheduled to charge the remaining £6,000 to my credit card on October 15th. I'm so happy for you, I said, finishing my wine. You deserve a good vacation. They exchanged satisfied glances, clearly believing that their plan was working perfectly. Poor, naive children. They had no idea what was in store for them. The 15th of October was surprisingly sunny for mid-autumn. I woke up early, long before dawn, and lay in bed for a long time, staring at the gradually lightening sky outside my window. Today was the day the final payment for Helen and Ezra's cruise was due, £6,000 on my credit card. Since our dinner a week ago, I hadn't spoken to my daughter and son-in-law. It was typical of our relationship. They only remembered me when they needed something. The rest of the time, I was just a distant memory, an old man living somewhere on the fringes of their lives. I got up, showered, and dressed especially carefully. Navy blue suit, white shirt, thin striped tie. Elizabeth always said that suit made me look like someone I'd rather not mess with. Today I needed that effect more than ever, even if my adversaries wouldn't see me. After breakfast of oatmeal and strong tea, I sat down at my desk in the study. The clock showed 8:30. The bank would open in half an hour. I laid out all the documents in front of me, the card statements that clearly showed the Royal Cruise Line deposit transaction, the printout of the phone call with the travel company that confirmed the booking in Wordsworth's name, the notes from our family dinner where I recorded every detail of their lives. At exactly 9 o'clock, I dialed the bank's number. After a few beeps, a young male voice answered. Royal Bank of Buckingham. How can I help you? Good morning. My name is Norton Butterfield. I'd like to speak to someone about some suspicious activity on my credit card. Of course, sir. I'll connect you with a security specialist now. After a short wait, I heard a different voice, more mature and confident. Security Department, Michael Green. What can I do for you? Good morning, Mr. Green. I've discovered unauthorized use of my credit card and would like to take action. I understand, sir. Let's do some identification first. Please give me the last 4 digits of your card and your date of birth. I provided the requested information, after which Michael continued. Thank you, Mr. Butterfield. Now tell us about the suspicious activity you've noticed. 3 weeks ago, a deposit of £2,000 was debited from my card in favor of Royal Cruise Line. I did not make that payment, and today, as far as I know, the final payment is due, another £6,000. You're right, Mr. Butterfield. There is a pending transaction on the system as of today's date. When did you discover the first payment? Almost immediately, but I decided to do my own investigation before I contacted the bank, I said, choosing my words carefully. You see, I have reason to believe that my card details have been copied by a member of my family. There was a pause at the other end of the line. I understand, Michael finally said. This is a delicate situation. What action would you like to take? I want to block today's payment and set a limit on large transactions on this card. Say no more than £100 per transaction. We can do that. But if you think there's been fraud, perhaps we should block the card completely and issue a new one. No, I replied firmly. I want to keep the existing card active but with restrictions. I have my reasons. As you wish, sir. Michael's voice was slightly perplexed, but he was professional enough not to ask unnecessary questions. I'll block today's transaction and set a £100 limit on all future transactions. This will take effect immediately. Excellent. One more question. If a payment is attempted over the limit, how will it look for the person attempting to pay? The transaction will be declined with the wording, "Transaction limit exceeded." No further explanation is given by the system. Perfect. I couldn't help but smile. Thank you for your help, Mr. Green. Always happy to help, Mr. Butterfield. If you have any more questions or concerns, don't hesitate to reach out. I hung up the phone and leaned back in my chair, feeling strangely satisfied. The first step had been taken. Now, Helen and Ezra wouldn't be able to pay for their luxury cruise with my money. But that was only part of the plan. It was time for the next move. I dialed Algie's number. My old friend answered after the first beep, as if he'd been expecting a call. Norton, did you make it? Yes, I answered briefly. The card is blocked for large payments. They won't be able to pay for the cruise. That's great. I got my part ready too. Yesterday, I met with Malcolm. Malcolm Price was an old acquaintance of Algie's, a senior inspector in Buckingham's tax office. They'd met back in the 80s when Algie was prosecuting a tax fraud case against a major construction company, and Malcolm was the prosecution's star witness. How was the meeting? I asked, feeling my pulse quicken. Excellent. Malcolm was very interested in the information about the informal counseling Ezra was providing to some taxpayers. He was particularly impressed with the specific names and amounts. 3 years ago, when I still had a relatively close relationship with my daughter's family, Ezra got drunk at Christmas dinner one day and started bragging about how he was helping some wealthy clients reduce their tax payments. Names, amounts, specific schemes slipped into his drunken rant. I pretended not to listen at the time, but I memorized every word. It's an old engineer's habit to pay attention to detail. Malcolm said he'd initiate an internal audit today, Algie continued. He can't promise instant results, but the process will be set in motion. That's enough, I said. It's important that Ezra feel threatened. He will, Algie assured me. Malcolm promised that the testing would be thorough. We ended the conversation agreeing to meet in a couple days to discuss the next steps. The next item on my plan required a visit to the office. I grabbed my file folder, got in my car, and headed to downtown Buckingham, where Benjamin Foxley's notary office was located. Benjamin had been my notary for over 20 years, and he had also handled the probate of my will after Elizabeth's death. Foxley's office was in an old Victorian building with heavy wooden doors and a brass sign. Inside, it smelled of wood polish and old books, a smell I'd always associated with reliability and stability. The receptionist, a young woman with a pleasant smile, recognized me and immediately ushered me into Benjamin's office. "Mr. Butterfield." Benjamin stood up from his desk to shake my hand. He was a full-figured man in his 60s, with a neat gray beard and shrewd eyes behind gold-rimmed glasses. "What can I do for you?" "Hello, Benjamin. I'm here to discuss the changes in my will." Benjamin raised his eyebrows slightly, but immediately returned his face to a professional expression. He pointed me to the chair across from his desk. "Sure. What changes would you like to make?" I sat down, put the file in front of me, and looked directly at the notary. "I wish to exclude my daughter Helen Wordsworth from being an heir, completely." Benjamin froze for a moment, but quickly managed his surprise. "I see. What about your son, Percy Butterfield?" "I would like to reduce his share to the minimum legally possible. I would like to pass the bulk of the estate to my grandchildren, Percy's children, not Helen's, when they reach the age of 25. Until then, the funds are to be held in a trust under the administration of a trustee appointed by me." Benjamin made notes, occasionally looking up at me. "If I may pry, Mr. Butterfield, what prompted this radical change?" I had expected that question. Benjamin wasn't just my notary. Over the years, we had become almost friends. Let's just say that I realized that some members of my family did not deserve the trust I had placed in them. Benjamin nodded understandingly. He had probably seen enough family dramas and betrayals in his long career. "Who would you like to appoint as trustee of the trust?" "Algernon Holder." "He's agreed to accept that responsibility." "An excellent choice. Mr. Holder is a respected lawyer with an impeccable reputation." We spent the next hour discussing the details of the new will. Benjamin asked clarifying questions, suggested legal language, and explained the consequences of certain decisions. Finally, when all the questions were clarified, he leaned back in his chair. "I will draft a new will by the end of the week. You'll be able to review it, and if everything is in order, we'll formalize the document. We'll need 2 witnesses who are not your heirs." "That won't be a problem," I said. "Algie will bring a reliable person." "Excellent." Benjamin made a final note and closed his notebook. "May I ask, are you sure of your decision? Such a change could cause a strong reaction in your daughter and son." I allowed myself a thin smile. "I'm fully aware of the consequences, Benjamin. Believe me, this decision was not made spontaneously." He nodded, not asking any more questions. That was one of the reasons I valued Benjamin as a notary. He could walk the fine line between professional care and respect for his client's personal decisions. As I left the notary's office, I felt a strange sense of relief. It was as if the weight I had been carrying for years had begun to lift off my shoulders. For the first time in a long time, I acted not as a dutiful father, ready to forgive and tolerate any antics of his children, but as a man defending his dignity and his rights. On my way home, I stopped at a small coffee shop on Buckingham's Main Street. After ordering a cup of espresso, I sat at the window, watching the passers-by. People were going about their business, unaware of the little drama unfolding in the life of an elderly man. I suddenly wondered, how many such stories are hidden behind the facades of neat houses in our town? How many elderly parents suffer from neglect, or worse, financial fraud on the part of their own children? My thoughts were interrupted by the ringing of the phone. Helen's name popped up on the screen. I felt my pulse quicken. Had she already found out about the failed cruise payment? Or had the bank somehow informed her of my call? I took a deep breath and answered in as neutral a tone as possible. "Hello, Helen." "Daddy." Her voice sounded upbeat and energetic. "How are you feeling?" "Not bad for my age," I answered, trying to sound normal. "What's wrong?" "Nothing much. I just wanted to see how you were doing. Ezra and I were wondering if we could come over this weekend. Help with the garden or fix something around the house." I almost choked on my coffee. In the last 5 years, Helen has never once offered to help around the house or garden without some ulterior motive. That's very kind of you, but I manage. The garden's fine and there's nothing in the house that needs urgent repair. Well, we could still stop by just to see each other, she insisted. Maybe bring some lunch. I could order something from that Italian diner you like. Now I was sure something was wrong. Helen had never memorized my food preferences, let alone offered to bring lunch. Is something wrong, Helen? I asked bluntly. There was a pause in the receiver for a moment. No, Dad, not at all. We just wanted to visit you. We are family after all. Of course, I said, deciding to play along. In that case, I'll be glad to see you on Saturday. But don't bother with lunch. I'll make something myself. All right, Papa. See you Saturday then. I hung up the phone and looked thoughtfully at the cup of cooling coffee. It was obvious that Helen and Ezra still didn't suspect anything. They were still preparing for their trip, probably already buying new swimsuits and sunglasses, making a list of excursions and planning what pictures they would post on social media to show off to their friends. It's funny how they overlooked the obvious. I never expressed a desire to share in the cost of their luxurious vacation. I never said I wanted to thank them for caring. They simply took what they thought was theirs by right, without giving any thought to my feelings or desires. Well, they will soon realize their mistake. Today, when the payment is rejected, panic will set in. They'll call the travel company, trying to figure out what happened. Maybe they'll try to reuse my card. Or they'll try to find another way to pay, realizing they risk losing both the cruise and the deposit. Meanwhile, Ezra's work is already starting an internal review. At first it will be just rumors, innuendo, slanted glances from colleagues. Then there will be official inquiries, demands for documentation, perhaps even an interview with the ethics committee. Notary Benjamin is preparing a new will that will deprive Helen of any hope of compensation for her care of her elderly father. All the gears of my plan were in motion. Now all that was left to do was wait and see how events would unfold themselves. I finished my coffee, paid, and went outside. The day was still clear and sunny, but now I looked at the world with a new feeling, not with the bitterness of a deceived father, but with the confidence of a man who had finally taken matters into his own hands. On the way home, I stopped at a bookstore and bought a guidebook to Scotland. For a long time I had dreamed of visiting the mountain lakes and ancient castles of this wonderful country, but I had always postponed the trip. First because of work, then because of Elizabeth's illness, then because of my own indecision. Now that I was free from the shackles of a fake family relationship, it was time to realize this dream. I imagined Elgie and I exploring the Scottish countryside, staying in cozy inns, sampling the local whiskey, and listening to stories of clans and ancient battles. The thought made me smile. Perhaps old age is not such a bad time if you are free from manipulation and can manage your life as you see fit. At home, I spent the rest of the day gardening and reading a guidebook to Scotland. I checked my phone from time to time, expecting a call from Helen, but there was none. Apparently she didn't know about the problems with the cruise payment yet. Or perhaps she and Ezra were trying to work it out on their own, not wanting to arouse my suspicions. Either way, Saturday promised to be interesting. I smiled, imagining their faces when they realized their plan had failed, that their helpless father turned out to be not so helpless. Helen and Ezra continued to prepare for their trip, unaware that their luxury Mediterranean cruise was already anchored before they could set sail. Saturday came, unexpectedly quickly. I awoke at first light and immediately felt an unusual excitement. Today was to be the denouement of the first act of my little play. Helen and Ezra had promised to be here by lunchtime, and I had no doubt that by then they would be aware of the problems with the cruise payment. I spent the morning leisurely preparing a simple but elegant lunch. Roast beef from my mother's recipe, baked potatoes with rosemary, and homemade apple pie for dessert. Cooking always calmed me, allowed me to focus on the present moment without thinking of past hurts or future worries. Around 11 o'clock the phone rang. It was Algie. Norton, are you home? I need to talk to you right away. Yes, I'm making dinner for Helen and Ezra. They should be here by 1 o'clock. Oh, good. Then I'll be there in time. I'll be there in 15 minutes. Algie wasn't saying much, which was unusual for him. I sensed something important had happened. Exactly 15 minutes later, the doorbell rang. Algie looked excited, his eyes shining, his cheeks flushed. Malcolm called me, he said as soon as he stepped through the door. The IRS has started an audit of the department where Ezra works. They're asking for all the files he's had for the last 3 years. I smiled, taking off my apron. Faster than I expected. Malcolm doesn't waste any time. He said the information was so specific they couldn't ignore it. Names, dates, amounts, it all adds up. Ezra must have found out about the audit by now? Oh yeah. Malcolm said notices were sent out to everyone in the department yesterday afternoon. Ezra must have heard by now. I nodded, imagining Ezra getting that notice. Pale, looking around, wondering who might have initiated the audit, going over all his machinations in his mind, trying to figure out what traces he might have left behind. What about the cruise payment? Algie asked. Did you check your card? Yeah, last night. There was an attempted charge, but the transaction was declined due to exceeding the limit as planned. Algie rubbed his hands together. Well, you're in for an interesting lunch today. I'm sure it is. They'll probably come up with some story to explain why they need the money. So how are you going to do it? I'm going to play the caring father who doesn't suspect a thing. I'll give them a chance to tell their side of the story, and then, I smiled, I'll show them I know the truth. Algie nodded approvingly. That's a good plan, but be careful. When people are backed into a corner, they can get aggressive. I know my daughter, Algie. She'd rather try to manipulate than attack outright. We talked some more, discussing details, and then Algie left, wishing me luck. I went back to the kitchen to finish preparing for dinner. At exactly 1 o'clock in the afternoon, with military precision, the doorbell rang. I took a deep breath, preparing myself for the performance to come, and went to open it. Helen and Ezra stood on the threshold. At first glance, I realized that my assumptions were correct. Helen looked tense, her usually flawless makeup hastily applied, and there was worry in her eyes. Ezra, on the other hand, looked sickly, pale face, sweat on his forehead, and a nervous look in his eyes. Daddy. Helen tried to feign joy, but her voice sounded fake. How happy we are to see you. She hugged me with exaggerated enthusiasm. Ezra only shook my hand weakly, mumbling an inarticulate greeting. Come in, I said, pretending not to notice their condition. Lunch is almost ready. I hope you're hungry? Oh, yes, of course, Helen said, following me into the living room. It smells delicious. I noticed them exchanging quick glances. They clearly rehearsed the conversation on the way here, agreeing on who was going to say what. Have a seat, and I'll get you an aperitif, I said, pointing to the couch. How's work going, Ezra? My brother-in-law flinched as if he'd been punched. Nah, normal, he mumbled. Just routine. Really? I feigned interest. No interesting cases or tests. Ezra paled even more, if that was even possible. No, nothing special. I nodded, hiding a smile, and went to the kitchen to get drinks. When I returned with the tray, Helen and Ezra were quietly arguing about something, but instantly stopped talking when they saw me. Sherry for the ladies, scotch for the gentlemen, I announced, setting the glasses down. To family. We drank, and I noticed that Ezra drained his glass in one gulp, clearly in need of the calming effect of alcohol. So, I began in a casual tone, how are the preparations for your cruise coming along? It's less than a week away, right? Helen almost choked on her sherry. Ezra stared at the floor. Actually, Dad, Helen began cautiously, that's what we wanted to talk about. About the cruise? I acted surprised. Is something wrong? Helen set her glass down and stepped forward, adopting the expression I knew so well, a mixture of concern and determination, the mask she wore when she was about to manipulate. You see, there's been a little problem with the payment. The company that's organizing the lottery, she cast a quick glance at Ezra, has run into some legal difficulties, and the payment of the prize has been delayed. Really? I tried to look concerned. So, what's the deal now? We have to pay in full by the end of the day, or we lose both the reservation and the deposit, Ezra interjected, clearly following a pre-arranged script. 2 months ago, we paid the deposit out of our own money and the balance was supposed to cover the winnings. I grinned mentally. What an ingenious lie. The deposit, of course, had been made from my card, not from their own funds. That's terrible, I said, shaking my head. How much can you lose? £2,000, Helen replied, biting her lip. Plus all the vacation days we've booked, which we won't be able to reschedule. I pretended to be deeply thoughtful. And the total cost of the cruise? $8,000, Ezra said. We'll need to pay 6 more. $8,000? I raised my eyebrows. That's a pretty expensive trip for a prize in the work lottery. Helen quickly interjected, it was a special raffle for top executives, very exclusive. I see. I nodded, as if that explanation satisfied me completely. So what do you plan to do? Helen and Ezra exchanged glances again. The crucial moment of their introduction had arrived. Actually, Dad, Helen took a deep breath, we were hoping you could help us out. Borrow $6,000 until next month. As soon as the company solves its problems and pays out the winnings, we'll pay you back right away. I pretended to seriously consider their request. Then I slowly shook my head. I'm not sure that's a good idea. $6,000 is a lot of money. And then if there are legal problems with the lottery, who knows when they'll be resolved? But, Dad? Helen's voice became pleading. We've already planned everything. We've taken vacations, bought new clothes, even booked excursions. And then, this is our first real vacation in 5 years. I sighed, feigning doubt. I understand, but $6,000, that's almost all of my savings for a rainy day. We'll pay it back, Helen exclaimed, starting to lose her temper. I swear it. I stood up and paced the room as if I needed movement to gather my thoughts. Let's look at this situation from the other side, I said, stopping at the window. You say you made the deposit 2 months ago. Yes, Helen answered quickly. At the end of August. And it was your own card? Of course, Ezra said, nervously adjusting his tie. My work card. I nodded slowly, looking out the window so they couldn't see the expression on my face. And the name of the cruise company? Royal Cruise Line, Helen replied. And what is your stateroom? I continued, gradually tightening the noose. Balcony, Ezra said. Premium. Premium, I repeated. Sounds luxurious. And what's the itinerary again? The Mediterranean, Helen said. 12 days with stops in Lisbon, Barcelona, Rome, Venice, and the Greek islands. I smiled, still standing with my back to them. Mediterranean Elegance, I pronounced. One of Royal Cruise Line's most popular itineraries. Silence hung in the room. I turned around slowly and saw Helen and Ezra frozen with a look of utter confusion on their faces. Where did... Helen started, but stopped short. I walked over to the desk, opened a drawer, and pulled out a file folder. You know, I've always been a curious person, I said, turning back to them. When you told me about your winnings, I decided to find out more about the cruise. I called Royal Cruise Line, introduced myself as a potential client, and inquired about their offerings. I opened a folder and pulled out a printout. Imagine my surprise when the operator, upon hearing the last name Wordsworth, immediately found your reservation. Mediterranean Elegance, October 20th, premium cabin with balcony. Deposit £2,000, full price $8,000. I put the printout on the table in front of them, except the operator didn't say anything about a lottery. She did mention that the deposit was made on a credit card in the name of Norton Butterfield. Helen and Ezra's faces turned as pale as chalk. They stared at the printout as if it were a poisonous snake. "Dad, we can explain," Helen began, but I held up my hand, stopping her. "There's no need. I understand perfectly well. You thought the old man was too stupid to notice that £8,000 had been debited from his card. Or perhaps you thought I didn't deserve the money, that it was rightfully yours?" "We were going to tell you," Ezra muttered, looking down at the floor. "After the cruise. As a surprise." "Surprise?" I couldn't hold back a bitter laugh. "A surprise for who? For me?" "Surprise, Dad. We stole your money, but we had a great vacation." "We didn't steal it," Helen exclaimed, taking the offensive as I expected. "We just borrowed. We'd be sure to pay it back." "When?" I asked calmly. "A month from now? A year? Never? And how would you explain writing off that money to me if I noticed?" Helen and Ezra were silent, cornered. "What I want to understand," I continued, sitting down across from them, "is why. Why did you think you were entitled to my money without my knowledge or consent?" Helen looked up, and I saw in her eyes not remorse, but indignation. "Because we deserve it," she said sharply. "We took care of you for years, calling, visiting, helping with paperwork and bills. You have no idea how much time and effort we put in." I looked at my daughter, and my heart clenched with bitterness. In her eyes I saw not love or respect, but cold calculation. To her, I was not a father, but a source of resources that she felt were rightfully hers. "Is that caring?" I asked quietly. "Visiting your father once a month when you need something, calling on birthdays and Christmas, checking to see if I'm still alive to make sure the inheritance is safe." "You're being unfair," Helen said, but there was no conviction in her voice. "We were doing more than you think." "Have we?" I shook my head. "When I had the flu last winter, who brought me medicine and food? Algie. Who helps me with the garden when my back refuses to work? Mrs. Parker, the neighbor. Who calls just to ask how I'm doing with no ulterior motive? My friends from the chess club." I paused, looking them in the eye. "All I ever got from you was disdain disguised as concern. You came when you needed money. You called when you wanted a birthday or Christmas present. Invited you to dinner when you were planning another manipulation." Ezra stared at the floor, unable to meet my gaze. Helen, on the other hand, straightened up, an angry glint in her eyes. "It's not fair," she repeated. "We did care about you. Maybe not in the way you expected, but we did the best we could. We have our own lives, our own problems. We can't keep running around you all the time." "I never asked for that," I replied calmly. "All I wanted was honesty and respect, but instead you decided to steal my money." "We didn't steal it," Helen exclaimed again. "We just wanted a vacation, and yes, we may have done wrong by taking your card without asking. But after all the years we've taken care of you, don't we deserve a little gratitude?" I looked at my daughter with sadness. Did she really believe what she was saying? Or was this just another attempt at manipulation? "Gratitude can't be stolen, Helen," I said quietly. "It can only be earned. And if you think that years of formal attention entitles you to my money, you're sorely mistaken." Ezra, who had been silent until then, suddenly looked up. "We admit we did wrong," he said, and there was a pleading note in his voice. "But we're in dire straits now. If we don't pay for the cruise by the end of the day, we'll lose both the deposit and the vacation days we booked. Not to mention that all our friends know about the trip," Helen added. "We've already told everyone about the cruise. Can you imagine how we'd look if we suddenly canceled it?" I couldn't believe my ears. Even now that their deception had been exposed, they were only thinking about their reputation and convenience. "What do you suggest?" I asked, even though I already knew the answer. "Lend us the money," Helen said, and it sounded not like a request but a demand. "6,000. We'll pay you back as soon as we can." "After everything you've done, you dare ask me for money?" I shook my head. You tried to steal 8,000 pounds from me, lied to my face, and now you're asking me to give you 6,000 willingly. It's not like that, Helen objected, but her voice sounded unsure. We just didn't think. It was a mistake. A mistake, I grinned bitterly. A mistake is when you accidentally dial the wrong number or forget to turn off the lights. What you did was a conscious decision. You planned everything: how to copy my card details, how to make the deposit, how to lie to me about winning the lottery. That's not a mistake, Helen. It's a betrayal. There was a heavy silence in the room. I could see the emotions alternating on Helen's face: anger, fear, despair. Ezra just sat there with his head down as if resigned to defeat. "What are you going to do?" Helen finally asked. "Should I go to the police?" "I could," I answered. "I have all the evidence: card statements, information from the cruise company, your own confession." "It's fraud, Helen, a felony." Ezra shuddered, imagining what this would do to his career at the IRS, especially now that the audit had begun there. "But you won't do it," Helen said, a note of confidence in her voice. "You wouldn't apply for your own daughter." I stared at her for a long moment, thinking. She was right. I wasn't going to go to the police, not out of pity for her, but because I had another plan. "You're right," I finally said. "I won't go to the police, at least not yet." I could see them both relax a little, figuring the worst was over. "But I won't give you any money either," I continued. "Not 6,000, not sixpence. You've created this situation and you'll have to deal with the consequences." "But Dad," Helen began, switching back into manipulation mode, "we're going to lose the deposit. 2,000 pounds will just disappear." "Not my problem," I said firmly. "You made a deposit on my card without my permission. Consider that a lesson for the future." Helen and Ezra looked at each other, unsure of what to do next. Their plan was crumbling before their eyes, and they had no backup. "What about lunch?" I asked, standing up. "I made roast beef. It would be a shame if it went to waste." They stared at me in bewilderment, not understanding how I could be thinking about food at a time like this. "I'm not hungry," Helen said coldly. "Suit yourself," I shrugged. "Then I guess our conversation is over then." I headed for the door, signaling that the meeting was over. Helen and Ezra reluctantly rose from the couch. "This isn't over," Helen said, walking past me. "You're going to regret this." I just nodded silently, not wanting to continue the pointless argument. When the door closed behind them, I went back into the living room and sank into a chair, feeling a strange mixture of relief and sadness. The first part of my plan had been accomplished. I had exposed their deception and denied them financial support. Now I had to finish what I had started. I dialed Algie's number. "How did it go?" he asked without preamble. "Exactly as we expected," I replied. "They came asking for money under the pretense of problems with the lottery winnings. When I revealed that I knew the truth, Helen started saying that they deserved my money for their years of caring." "And how did it end?" "I turned them down and hinted that I might go to the police if they kept pushing." "Did they get angry?" Helen was. Ezra was more scared. He was clearly more concerned about the job review than canceling the cruise. "Not surprising," Algie hummed. "Malcolm had said the audit would be very thorough. If Ezra really was taking bribes, he'd be in a lot of trouble." "Well," I said, "the first act is over. Now it's time to prepare for Act 2. "Are you sure you want to go on?" There was a note of concern in Algie's voice. Maybe the lesson they'd learned today was enough. I thought for a moment, remembering the look on Helen's face when she said she deserved my money. There was no remorse or shame in her eyes, just indignation that her plan had failed. "No," I said firmly. "It's not enough. They have to realize that their actions have consequences, real consequences." It had been a week since our unpleasant conversation with Helen and Ezra. In that time, I hadn't received a call or text from them, an unusually long silence for Helen, who usually didn't miss an opportunity to voice her displeasure. I assumed they were still mulling over what had happened, perhaps looking for other ways to pay for the cruise or trying to recover at least part of the deposit. In the meantime, I finalized the process of changing the will. Benjamin Foxley prepared all the paperwork, and yesterday Algie and I and his old colleague, retired Judge Thomas Harrington, officially signed the new version. Helen was completely excluded, and Percy's share was substantially reduced. The bulk of the inheritance went to my Percy grandchildren, the twins Alfred and Agatha, but only when they reached the age of 25. Until then, the funds were to be administered by Algie as trustee. I learned from Malcolm, through Algie, that the IRS audit was gaining momentum. The commission had already asked Ezra to explain several suspicious cases, and it appeared that his position was becoming increasingly precarious. It was time for the final act of my little drama. I called Helen and invited her and Ezra to dinner, saying that I wanted to discuss the situation and perhaps find a compromise solution. She agreed reluctantly, but I could hear the hope in her voice. She probably thought I had changed my mind and would give them the money for the cruise after all. I set dinner for Wednesday night at 7 o'clock. I spent the entire day preparing not only the food, but also my speech. I wanted to be precise and clear, leaving no room for manipulation or misunderstanding. An hour before they arrived, Algie came in. We sat in the living room, sipping scotch and discussing the final details. "Are you sure you want a complete breakup?" Algie asked. "They are your family, after all." I shook my head. They stopped being my family the moment they decided they could steal from me. Real family doesn't do that. Algie nodded without arguing. He understood better than anyone what I'd been through over the years. "And you really want to go to Scotland? It's pretty cold there in late October." I smiled. "Algie, I'm 74 years old. I've put off my desires long enough for the sake of others. It's time to start living for myself while there's still time." My friend raised his glass. "Here's to a new chapter in your life, Norton." We drank, and shortly afterward Algie left. He didn't want to be present for the conversation, thinking it should be a family affair. But we agreed to meet tomorrow to discuss the details of our trip to Scotland. At 7 o'clock sharp, the doorbell rang. I took a deep breath, gathering my courage, and went to open it. Helen and Ezra stood on the doorstep. Both of them looked tense and tired, especially Ezra. His face was gaunt, and there were dark circles under his eyes as if he hadn't slept in nights. "Come in," I said, trying to sound neutral. They walked silently into the living room. I noticed that they kept their distance from each other, a sign that they were probably at odds. "Have a seat," I pointed to the couch. "Would you like something to drink?" "No, thank you," Helen answered dryly. "Let's get right to the point, Dad. You said you wanted to discuss a compromise." I nodded and sat down in the chair opposite them. "Yes, I want to clear the air and determine how we're going to move forward." Ezra was nervously rubbing the cuff of his shirt. Helen sat up straight with her hands folded in her lap, a posture she always adopted when she was preparing for a confrontation. "For starters," I said, "I'd like to know if you've been able to resolve the cruise issue." Helen pressed her lips together. "No, we lost both the deposit and the reservation." "I see," I nodded. "What about the vacation?" "We had to cancel," Ezra answered quietly. "Work is a complicated situation at work right now." I looked at him more closely. From the look of him, difficult situation was an understatement. "A test?" I asked innocently. Ezra flinched, and Helen threw me a sharp look. "How do you know about the test?" she asked suspiciously. I shrugged my shoulders. "Buckingham is a small town. News travels fast." Ezra swallowed nervously. "Yeah, there's an internal audit going on at the IRS right now. The whole department is under investigation." "That's unpleasant," I said, trying to sound sympathetic. And why such a check suddenly? Anonymous denunciation, Ezra answered, his voice trembling. Someone provided information about misconduct by certain employees. Including you? I asked bluntly. Ezra lowered his eyes, not answering. Helen intervened. It's just a misunderstanding. Ezra has an impeccable reputation. The commission will look into it and everything will be cleared up. I nodded, pretending to believe it. I hope so. By the way, while we're on the subject of official business, I wanted to let you know that I've made some changes to my will. Helen tensed even more, if that was even possible. What kind of changes? Substantial ones, I replied. I have completely excluded you, Helen, from inheritance. Her face showed shock, which quickly turned to rage. You can't do that, she exclaimed. I am your daughter. I can and I did, I replied calmly. The will was formalized and signed yesterday in the presence of 2 witnesses. It's not fair. Helen jumped up from the sofa. Just because of one mistake you're taking me out of the will? I looked at her for a long moment. It's not one mistake, Helen. It's the culmination of years of neglect, manipulation, and lies. You and Ezra tried to steal a substantial amount of money from me. That's not a mistake, that's a crime. What about Percy? She asked, ignoring my words. Did you cut him out too? I've reduced his share to the minimum legally possible. The bulk of the inheritance will now go to my grandchildren by Percy when they turn 25. Until then, the funds will be administered by a trustee. That's not fair, Helen exclaimed. Percy doesn't even visit you. He calls once a year at Christmas, and that's only because I remind him. And yet, he's never tried to steal my money, I replied. But that wasn't the only thing I wanted to talk about. I pulled an envelope out of my desk drawer and placed it on the table in front of them. What's this? Ezra asked, looking at the envelope apprehensively. A copy of an anonymous letter that was sent to the IRS 2 weeks ago. It contains information about your informal counseling for certain clients, Ezra, with names, dates, and amounts. Ezra turned so pale I was afraid he was going to be sick. Helen looked from the envelope to me, her face contorted with anger and shock. Was that you? Ezra whispered. You sent the denunciation? Technically, I didn't, I answered honestly. But the information was provided by me. Why? Ezra looked completely crushed. Why are you doing this to me? For the same thing I did to Helen, I said. For years of lies, manipulation, and neglect. For treating me not as a father and father-in-law, but as a convenient ATM machine to be used at will. Helen seemed ready to explode with rage. You're ruining our lives, she screamed. Because of some stupid cruise, you're willing to destroy Ezra's career and disinherit me? No, Helen, I shook my head. Not because of a stupid cruise. It's because you've shown your true attitude toward me. You've shown that you don't see me as a man worthy of respect and honesty. To you, I'm just a source of resources, nothing more. I paused, giving them a chance to realize what I was saying. But I have a proposal, I continued, a compromise, if you will. They both looked at me warily. I won't file a formal police report about my credit card fraud. That could cause more problems for Ezra, especially now that he's already under investigation by the IRS. I saw a flicker of hope in their eyes. All I ask in return is that you disappear from my life completely. What? Helen looked stunned. No calls, visits, letters, or messages. No chance encounters in town. No contact at all. I want you to cease to exist for me, and I for you. Ezra stared silently at the floor, but Helen was outraged. You can't demand such a thing. I am your daughter. I can and I do, I answered firmly. And it's because you're my daughter that it hurts me the most to see the kind of man you've grown into. A man who thinks it's okay to steal from his own father. I took a small flash drive out of my pocket and placed it next to the envelope. Here is all the evidence of your fraud. Your card statements. A recording of my conversation with Royal Cruise Line confirming reservations in your names, and even a recording of our conversation where you actually admitted to the theft. If you violate our agreement, that information will go to the police." Ezra looked utterly mortified. Helen, on the other hand, was looking at me with such hatred that I felt uncomfortable for a moment. "You're going to regret this," she said quietly. "You're an old, sick man. Who's going to take care of you when you can't take care of yourself?" "I have friends, Helen," I answered. "Real friends who appreciate me for who I am, not for my money or possible inheritance. And unlike you, they've never betrayed me." I stood up, signaling that the conversation was over. "Now, I think you'd better leave. Our dinner is canceled." Ezra rose heavily from the couch, still avoiding my eyes. Helen gave me one last furious glare. "You're going to regret this," she said again. "When you're alone, without family, without support, you'll remember this day." "Maybe," I said calmly. "But at least I'll know I did the right thing and kept my dignity. Now please leave." They silently headed for the exit. I walked them to the door, and when they were already on the threshold, I said, "Goodbye, Helen, Ezra. I wish you to find the peace and understanding you so desperately lack." Helen snorted and walked quickly to the car. Ezra paused for a moment, as if he wanted to say something, but then just nodded and followed his wife. I closed the door and leaned my back against it. A strange feeling of desolation and relief came over me at the same time. It was as if the heavy weight I'd been carrying for years had finally been lifted. I didn't feel joy or triumph, just a quiet, sad certainty that I had done the right thing. I went back to the living room, sat down in my favorite chair, and poured myself a scotch. The first sip burned my throat, but it was strangely comforting. I thought about Elizabeth, about what she would say if she knew about my decision. She would probably be saddened by the breakup with her daughter, but knowing her fair nature, I was sure she would understand. The next few days passed in preparation for the trip to Scotland. Algie and I booked rooms in small hotels along our route, made a list of places we wanted to visit, even bought new hiking boots for long walks through the hills and valleys. On the morning of the day of departure, I got up particularly early. I drank a cup of strong tea, watching the first rays of sunlight color my garden with golden hues. Strangely, I didn't feel any regret for breaking up with Helen and Ezra. It felt like I was finally free of the heavy shackles I'd worn all these years out of a sense of duty and familial attachment. I checked that everything was packed, locked up the house, and went outside, where Algie was waiting for me in his old but immaculately maintained Jaguar. "Ready for an adventure?" he asked with a smile. "More than ready," I replied, getting into the passenger seat. We left Buckingham as the town was just waking up. We had long hours of driving ahead of us, but I didn't feel tired or impatient. On the contrary, every mile that separated me from my former life brought a sense of freedom and new possibilities. "You know," Algie said as we got on the freeway, "I've always believed that it's never too late to start living the life you want. Even at our age." I looked out the window at the scenery floating by the fields, the villages, the hills rolling away to the horizon. The world was vast and beautiful, and now, freed from the weight of a false relationship, I could finally see it in all its glory. "You are right, my friend," I replied. "It's never too late." The car drove smoothly down the freeway, taking us farther and farther away from Buckingham, from the past, from years of disappointment and compromise. Scottish lakes, majestic castles, cozy villages with small pubs, where real whiskey is served and ancient legends are told. Freedom was ahead, and I was ready to embrace it.